The antiseptic smell hit first, sharp, chemical, the kind that coats the back of your throat and sits there like a warning. Then came the sounds. The rhythmic beep of machines, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, voices murmuring behind curtains thin as secrets. I opened my eyes to fluorescent lights, their harsh white glow stabbing through my pupils. My mouth tasted like copper and something bitter, medicinal. The pillow beneath my head crackled with each small movement, paper-covered and institutional. A hospital room. But that made no sense. I wasn't supposed to be... The thought fragmented before it could complete itself, scattering like marbles across a tilted floor. My hands moved to my face without conscious direction, fingers trembling as they traced features that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. Smooth skin, no wrinkles. The bone structure of my jaw felt sharper, more defined than I remembered. Than I remembered from when? "You're awake." A nurse appeared in my peripheral vision, young and tired-looking, her ponytail slightly askew. She reached for my wrist, fingers pressing against my pulse point with practiced efficiency. "How are you feeling? Any dizziness? Nausea?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a rasp. She held a small cup of water to my lips, and I drank gratefully, the cool liquid shocking my system into fuller awareness. "Where?" I managed. "Mercy General, you've been here about 6 hours." She made notes on a tablet, not quite meeting my eyes. "The doctor will be in soon to discuss your discharge. Your family's been notified." Family. The word dropped into my consciousness like a stone into still water, sending ripples through memories I couldn't quite grasp. Something about that word felt wrong, dangerous even, though I couldn't articulate why. "What happened?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, fragments were beginning to surface. A car. Rain. The screech of tires on wet asphalt. But beneath those recent memories, something else lurked. Older, darker, like sediment at the bottom of a deep lake. "Minor car accident," the nurse said, her tone suggesting this was information I should already possess. "You're very lucky, just some bruising and a mild concussion. They'll want to monitor you for 24 hours, but the scans came back clear." She left, her shoes making that distinctive squeak against the floor. I lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, trying to understand why my heart was racing, why every cell in my body seemed to be screaming that something was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The door opened again. High heels this time, clicking against linoleum with a staccato rhythm that sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. "Wei Wei," my mother's voice, but hearing it felt like touching a live wire, shock and recognition and something else, something that tasted like ash and old grief. She swept into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume, Chanel No. 5, the scent I'd known since childhood. Her hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the late hour. Designer handbag, tailored coat, the armor of a woman who'd learned early that appearance was everything. Oh, thank God, she pressed manicured fingers to her lips, and I watched her face crumple with what looked like genuine relief. When they called, I thought, I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. I stared at her, and the strangest sensation washed over me. I knew this face, had known it all my life, but I was also seeing it from some other angle, some other life. In my mind's eye, I could see her in this exact room, wearing a different outfit but the same expression of manufactured concern. Could hear her voice saying different words. She was already gone when we arrived. There was nothing anyone could do. But that hadn't happened. That was a memory that didn't exist yet. The thought crystallized with such sudden clarity that I gasped, and my mother rushed to my side, her cool hand pressed against my forehead. "Are you in pain? Should I call the nurse?" "No." The word came out too sharp, and I softened it with effort. "No, I'm fine, just, disoriented." She settled into the chair beside my bed, and I studied her face with new eyes. Or old eyes. Or whatever these eyes were. Eyes that had seen her tears at my funeral. Eyes that remembered her standing in another hospital room, accepting condolences while secretly calculating what she'd gain from the insurance payout. Except that funeral hadn't happened. Not yet. Not in this timeline. Timeline. The word felt both absurd and absolutely correct. I had died. I was certain of it with a bone-deep conviction that defied logic. I had died at 32, alone in a hospital room that smelled like this one, while my mother and sister stood in the hallway discussing funeral arrangements and inheritance splits. I had died because the memory hit like a fist to the solar plexus. My sister's face, pale and frightened. Lean as the doctors rushed around her bed. The wrong blood type. Type A positive flooding into veins that needed B negative. Her body rejecting it, shutting down, while I lay in another room dying from injuries that might have been survivable if only... "Where's Jinyi?" I asked, and my mother's expression shifted, subtle as a cloud passing over the sun. At home, resting. She wanted to come, but I told her one of us should stay with your father. She paused, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her coat. She feels terrible about the accident. You know how sensitive she is? Sensitive. The word was almost funny. Xinyi, my younger sister, who'd been everyone's darling since birth, beautiful where I was merely pretty, charming where I was reserved, needing protection where I had learned to stand on my own. Xinyi, who had stolen my medical records when we were in high school and never bothered to correct them, who had listed herself as type B negative, my blood type, on every form from college health services to her driver's license to her insurance paperwork. Such a small lie. Such a catastrophic consequence. But that consequence hadn't happened yet. In this moment, this now, Xinyi was fine. Healthy. Very much alive. And I was 18 years old again. The realization struck as I looked down at my hands, truly looked at them. No wedding ring, no faint scar on my thumb from the kitchen knife incident at 25. The veins showed blue-green beneath skin that was smoother, more elastic, unmarred by the decades I'd lived through before I died, before I was reborn into this exact moment, 6 hours after the minor car accident that had hospitalized me briefly in my first life, the accident that had somehow served as the catalyst for my return. My mother was still talking, something about insurance forms and how lucky I was that the other driver had accepted full responsibility. Her voice faded into white noise as I tried to organize my thoughts, to separate the memories of two lives that existed simultaneously in my mind. In my first life, I had been discharged from this hospital tomorrow morning. I had gone home, returned to my freshman year at university, lived a life that felt increasingly hollow as Xinyi absorbed all the light in every room. I had been the responsible daughter, the good student, the one who made sensible choices and dated appropriate men and never caused trouble. I had married at 28, a marriage my parents approved of, a man who looked good on paper and made me feel invisible in reality. And at 32, I had been in a car accident. A serious one this time. Multiple internal injuries, massive blood loss. I had needed transfusions, needed them urgently, but I'd been unconscious and unable to advocate for myself. Xinyi had been the one to provide my medical information to the doctors. Xinyi, whose records showed the same blood type as mine, or what she'd claimed was hers. B negative, she'd told them with confidence, because that's what all her forms said. What she'd memorized years ago when she first made the switch. But Xinyi was type A positive, and when they'd rushed blood to her during her own emergency appendectomy, an emergency that happened while I was still in surgery, they'd grabbed the first compatible units. They'd given her B negative blood, my blood type, the type she'd claimed as her own on every medical form for the past 14 years. Her body had rejected it. Acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. I'd learned the term later after she was gone, after the medical review board had investigated and found the error in her records. Records she had falsified so long ago that no one could quite trace when or why. She had died because she'd lied about who she was. And I had died 2 days later, not from my injuries, but from complications, from the stress of losing her, from the way my parents had looked at me as if I had somehow failed by surviving when their favorite daughter had not. But now, I was here. Now I had a chance to what? Save her? Expose her? The fury that rose in me was so sudden and intense that I had to grip the hospital bed's metal railing to keep my hands from shaking. 14 years of being overlooked, of watching her take and take and take, of being the responsible one who never complained while she played the fragile princess. 14 years of her living a lie built partially on my identity, culminating in her death and mine. Wei Wei, my mother's hand touched my arm. You've gone pale. I'm calling the nurse. No, I forced myself to breathe, to unclench my fingers. I'm fine, just tired. She studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. In my first life, I would have assumed it was concern. Now, with the clarity of hindsight and death, I recognized it for what it was. Assessment. She was calculating whether this incident would interfere with the family's plans, whether my recovery would cost too much in time or money or social capital. Well, get some rest then. Your father and I will come by in the morning to bring you home. She stood, smoothing her coat again. And Wei Wei, try not to worry your sister with any dramatics. You know how fragile her nerves are? Fragile? That word again. The excuse for everything. After she left, I lay in the darkness, listening to the hospital sounds that had become eerily familiar. The distant murmur of the nurse's station, the beep of monitors, the occasional code announcement crackling over the intercom. My mind raced through calculations, through memories, through the implications of being given a second chance at a life I'd barely lived the first time around. The blood type issue wouldn't come up for another 14 years if I let things proceed naturally. Xinyi's appendicitis wouldn't occur until she was 32, the same age I'd been when I died. But knowing what I knew, could I let it play out? Should I? The moral calculus made my head hurt. She had stolen my medical identity, yes, but out of teenage thoughtlessness rather than malicious intent. She probably didn't even remember doing it by now. The lie having been repeated so many times, it had become her truth. In the first timeline, her death had been a tragedy, a medical error that devastated the family. But I remembered something else too. Standing at her funeral, watching my parents grieve for the daughter they'd loved, and realizing that no one was grieving for me the same way. That I had always been the supporting character in the story of Cindy's life. That even my death, 2 days after hers, had been seen as a sort of afterthought, a sad footnote to the real tragedy of losing their beautiful, delicate, favored child. The bitterness of that memory tasted worse than the antiseptic smell of the hospital. I reached for the cup of water on the bedside table, my hand steadier now. The plastic was cool against my palm, real and solid. This was real. This second chance was real. And I had no idea what to do with it. The morning air smelled like exhaust and street vendor breakfast, fried dough and soy milk, scents that transported me instantly to 1,000 other mornings I'd lived through before, or would live through, or was living through again. The grammatical tenses of time travel were impossible. My father's car was parked in the hospital's pickup zone, and he stood beside it in his weekend casual wear, pressed khakis and a polo shirt that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. He'd always been a quiet man, expressing affection through providing rather than words, more comfortable with financial statements than emotional ones. Wei Wei. He nodded at me, and I caught the flicker of relief in his eyes before he masked it with his usual stoic expression. How are you feeling? Fine, Dad, really. I slid into the back seat, and the smell of leather and his particular brand of cologne, something woody and expensive, triggered another wave of double memories. Sitting in this car as a teenager, sitting in this car as an adult, after my wedding, after my divorce, No, those things hadn't happened yet. Or might never happen now. Zinni was already in the front passenger seat, and when she turned to look at me, I had to suppress the shock of seeing her alive. Young, 18 years old with her whole life ahead of her. In my memories, the last time I'd seen her, she was 32 and dying. Tubes and wires connecting her to machines that couldn't save her from the transfusion error, her skin gray pale, her lips cracked and dry. But here she was, fresh-faced and beautiful, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine concern. Gigi, she breathed, using the term for older sister. I'm so sorry. I should have been paying attention when I asked you to pass me the phone. This is all my fault. It took me a moment to understand what she was talking about. Then the memory surfaced, or the first timeline's memory at least. The accident had happened because Ginny had been in the passenger seat, had asked me to hand her the phone that had fallen by my feet, and in the split second I'd looked down, I drifted into the other lane. In my first life, I had accepted the blame, had spent weeks apologizing to her for the scare. Now, looking at her perfectly contrite expression, I wondered if that had been the point. It's fine, I said, keeping my voice level. Accidents happen. She reached back to squeeze my hand, and I let her, studying her face for signs of the person she would become, or had become, or might never become if I changed things enough. The drive home was quiet, the city sliding past the windows in familiar patterns. Our neighborhood was one of the older wealthy areas, and where money was quiet and dignified rather than flashy. Tree-lined streets, walls topped with security systems disguised as decorative ironwork, houses set back from the road with carefully manicured gardens. Our house appeared as we turned the corner, and I felt a strange doubled sensation: nostalgia and revulsion, comfort and claustrophobia. 3 stories of cream-colored stone, traditional architecture with modern security features, a home that had always felt more like a museum than a living space. "Your room is ready," my mother said as we pulled into the driveway. I had the housekeeper change the sheets and open the windows to air it out. My room. The phrase was almost amusing. In my first life, I'd spent less than a year in that room after turning 18. I'd moved to the university dorms as soon as possible, then to my own apartment after graduation. The room had been preserved like a shrine to the daughter I'd been expected to be. Neat, organized, full of academic achievements and not much else. Inside, the house smelled like furniture polish, and the lilies my mother kept in the entry hall, their sweet scent cloying and funereal. I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, my legs remembering the rhythm of these steps even as my mind reeled with the strangeness of being here again. My room was exactly as I remembered from my teenage years: the single bed with its white duvet, the desk organized with color-coded folders and labeled supply containers, the bookshelf alphabetized by author's last name. Awards and certificates lined one wall, evidence of my parents' investment in my education and my dutiful fulfillment of their expectations. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Impossible as it seemed, I was here, 18 years old again, with all my memories of the next 14 years intact. The knowledge of every mistake I'd made, every opportunity I'd missed, every moment I'd chosen duty over desire, and the knowledge of how it all ended. I moved to the desk, pulling open drawers with hands that remembered where everything was: school supplies, old notebooks, a journal I'd kept sporadically in my first life. I opened it, flipping through pages of teenage thoughts and concerns that felt simultaneously intimate and alien. That girl, that younger version of me, had been so earnest, so determined to be perfect, so desperate for approval. She had no idea what was coming. I sat on the bed, the mattress firm beneath me, and tried to think, practically. What were my goals here? What did I want from this second chance? In movies, this was where the protagonist would vow to fix everything, to prevent tragedies, to set all wrongs right. But my situation was more complicated than that. The tragedy that destroyed my first life wouldn't happen for 14 years, and preventing it would require confronting Zinni about something she'd done so long ago, she probably didn't even remember it. Moreover, what right did I have to revenge? She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Her lie about her blood type had been a foolish teenage decision, probably motivated by nothing more than wanting to be like me, the older sister who did everything right. The consequences had been unforeseeable. But then I remembered the last words I'd heard before I died. Not words spoken to me. I'd been alone in my hospital room, slipping away from internal bleeding complications. No, these were words I'd heard through the door, my parents' voices in the hallway as they discussed arrangements. "At least we still have the inheritance from Ginny's husband," my father had said, his voice heavy with grief. "We'll need it to cover the funeral costs for both of them." "Poor Ginny," my mother had replied. She was always so unlucky. And now Wei Wei too, though she did live longer at least, as if my death was less tragic simply because I'd survived my sister by 2 days, as if my existence had only mattered in relation to hers. The anger that rose in me was hot and bitter, and I clenched my fists against it. I had spent my entire first life trying to earn my parents' approval, their love, their acknowledgement. I had been the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who never caused problems or asked for too much. And in the end, I had been barely a footnote in the story of Shinny's tragedy. A knock on my door interrupted my spiraling thoughts. "Come in," I called, already knowing who it would be. Shinny slipped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She had changed into casual clothes, expensive loungewear that managed to look both comfortable and stylish, the kind of effortless perfection she'd always achieved. She perched on the edge of my desk chair, her expression uncertain. "Are you angry with me?" she asked quietly, a About the accident? I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to reconcile the dying woman from my memories with this vibrant, healthy teenager. No, I said truthfully. I'm not angry about the accident. She relaxed slightly. I've been so worried. You know how Mom and Dad get when anything goes wrong? I thought maybe you'd blame me and then things would be weird between us. There was genuine concern in her voice, and I reminded myself that this Ginny was not the same as the one I remembered. This was Ginny at 18, before life had happened to her, before she'd become the person she would eventually be. She was still young enough to change, to make different choices. Ginny, I said slowly, can I ask you something? Of course. What's your blood type? The question clearly surprised her. Her brow furrowed slightly. B negative, she said without hesitation. Same as yours. Why? The lie came so easily to her, so naturally, that I wondered if she even knew it was a lie anymore. How many times had she repeated it over the years? How thoroughly had she convinced herself it was true? Just curious, I said lightly. I couldn't remember if we'd ever had it confirmed. You know, officially. Oh, she waved a dismissive hand. Mom told me years ago when I had to fill out that form for school. Remember? The emergency contact thing. She said we were both B negative, like Dad. Interesting. She'd woven my mother into the lie, or perhaps genuinely believed that's how she'd learned the information. It would be so easy to confront her now, to insist we both get blood tests, to expose the discrepancy, but what would that accomplish? She'd be embarrassed, perhaps, and the records would be corrected, but without the context of the future tragedy, the revelation would seem petty. Yeah, like I was trying to catch her in a lie for no reason, and my parents would take her side. Of that, I was certain. They always took her side. You're right, I said instead. I remember now. She smiled, relieved, and stood. Get some rest, okay? I'll tell Mom you don't want to be disturbed for dinner. After she left, I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind churning. I had 14 years to figure this out. 14 years to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this second life. 14 years to prevent the tragedy, or let it unfold, or find some third option I hadn't thought of yet. The late afternoon sun slanted through my window, painting golden rectangles on the wall. In my first life, I had taken this moment for granted, this ordinary afternoon in an ordinary room. I had been so focused on the future, college, career, making my parents proud, that I'd forgotten to live in the present. I wouldn't make that mistake again. The university campus smelled like cut grass and coffee, thousands of students moving between buildings in a choreographed chaos of youth and ambition. I stood at the entrance to the liberal arts building, my backpack heavy with textbooks I'd already read in another life, and felt a strange sense of displacement. 2 weeks had passed since I'd woken up in the hospital. 2 weeks of readjusting to being 18, of navigating family dynamics with the uncomfortable knowledge of how they would play out. I'd returned to classes, slipped back into the routine of university life, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like watching a movie I'd already seen but had forgotten the ending to. Except I hadn't forgotten the ending. I remembered it with painful clarity. Wait up! I turned to see Chen Zhao jogging toward me, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Chen Zhao, who in my first life had been my study partner, my friend, eventually my confidant. Chen Zhao, who had stood at my funeral looking devastated, who I'd thought perhaps might have loved me in some quiet, unspoken way that neither of us had ever acknowledged. Looking at him now, 20 years old and full of easy enthusiasm, I felt a pang of something complicated. Grief for the friendship we'd had. Curiosity about what might have been if I'd been brave enough to see him as more than a friend. Awkwardness at knowing him in a way he didn't yet know me. Hey, I said, falling into step beside him. Did you finish the reading for comparative literature? Barely. Wiki, Professor Ming is going to destroy us with that pop quiz he keeps threatening. He grinned at me, and I remembered this smile, how it had been one of the few genuinely warm things in my first life. Want to grab coffee and review before class? In my first life, I had said no to this invitation, too focused on maintaining perfect grades and not wasting time socializing. I had been so serious, so determined to prove myself. It was one of many regrets I'd carried to my death. Sure, I said, and watched surprise flicker across his face. We settled into a corner table at the campus cafe, our textbooks spread between us alongside overpriced lattes. Chen Zhao launched into his interpretation of the reading, a postmodern novel about memory and identity that took on new resonance given my circumstances. The protagonist's insistence that he's lived before, Chen Zhao said, tapping the book's spine enthusiastically. It's meant to be metaphorical, right? The author's commentary on how we all carry our past selves forward, how we're constantly being reborn through our choices and experiences. Maybe, I said slowly, or maybe the protagonist has actually lived before, and everyone just thinks he's crazy because they can't conceive of such a thing being possible. Chen Zhao laughed. Literal rebirth? That's a bit too fantastical for postmodern literature, don't you think? Is it? I took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through me. I mean, people believe in reincarnation, past lives, the idea that consciousness might persist beyond death and find its way back. Why is that more fantastical than any other aspect of human existence we can't fully explain? He studied me with new interest. I didn't know you were into that sort of thing. I wasn't, or I hadn't been in my first life. I'd been practical, rational, focused on tangible achievements. But dying had a way of expanding one's perspective on what was possible, just thinking out loud, I said, redirecting the conversation back to the assignment. We studied for another hour, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the easy back and forth of ideas, the way Chen Zhao listened when I spoke like my thoughts actually mattered. It was something I'd forgotten about him, or maybe something I'd never properly appreciated the first time around. As we packed up to head to class, he hesitated, then said, "You seem different lately." Since the accident, I mean. More, he searched for the word. Present, I guess. Present. It was an odd but accurate observation. In my first life, I'd been so focused on the future, on becoming someone my parents could be proud of, that I'd barely existed in the moment. Now, with the future already lived through once, I found myself noticing things I'd missed before. The way sunlight filtered through the cafe windows, the background music that was surprisingly good, the genuine warmth in Chen Zhao's eyes when he looked at me. Maybe I'm just glad to be alive, I said lightly, and saw him nod as if this made perfect sense. Class was in one of the older buildings, all wood paneling and tall windows that let in too much sun or too much cold depending on the season. I settled into my usual seat. Third row, near the window, and felt Chen Zhao slide into the desk beside me. Professor Ming swept in punctually at 9, his gray hair slightly disheveled, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was one of those professors who lived for literature, who could make a 100-year-old novel feel urgent and relevant. In my first life, I'd appreciated his teaching, but had been too focused on grades to really engage with the material on a deeper level. "Pop quiz," he announced, and the class groaned collectively. But this time, I was prepared. Not because I'd studied harder, but because I'd already taken this exact quiz 14 years ago. The questions were burned into my memory. 3 short-answer questions about themes, character motivation, and narrative structure. I filled in my answers quickly. He then sat back and watched my classmates struggle with the same questions I remembered agonizing over in my first life. It should have felt like cheating, having advanced knowledge. Instead, it just felt empty. What was the point of acing a quiz when I already knew the grade was meaningless in the long run? After class, I walked across campus toward the science building, where I had a required biology course. The path took me past the student center, and on impulse, I detoured inside. The bulletin board near the entrance was covered in the usual assortment of flyers, club meetings, apartment rentals, study groups, event advertisements. I scanned them with new eyes, remembering opportunities I dismissed in my first life as distractions from my studies, creative writing workshop, photography club, volunteer at the local children's hospital. That last one caught my attention. In my first life, I'd never volunteered, never gave my time to anything that wasn't directly related to building my resume, but I remembered meeting a woman during my final hospital stay, an elderly volunteer who had sat with me when I was alone and dying, who had held my hand and told me stories about her life, her regrets, her hard-won wisdom about what mattered. "The tragedy isn't dying," she'd said, her weathered hand warm around mine. "The tragedy is never living in the first place." I pulled out my phone and photographed the flyer with the hospital's contact information. Maybe this time I could be that person for someone else. Maybe this time I could live instead of just existing. Biology class was in a lecture hall that seated 200 students. the kind of anonymous environment where it was easy to disappear. I found a seat near the back and pulled out my notebook, only half listening as the professor droned through a PowerPoint about cellular respiration. Halfway through the lecture, my phone buzzed with a text. "Xinyi, can you pick up Mom's prescription on your way home? She forgot, and the pharmacy closes at 6. I stared at the message, and a memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. This exact request. In my first life. I had agreed, had left campus early to get to the pharmacy, and in doing so had missed a crucial study group session that would have helped me understand the material for the midterm. I'd done poorly on that exam as a result, my first B+ in college, and my parents' disappointment had been a quiet, cutting thing. Meanwhile, Xinyi had been at home, doing nothing in particular, perfectly capable of picking up the prescription herself. I typed a response. "Can't. I have a lab that runs late. You'll need to go." The 3 dots appeared, indicating she was typing. Then, "But I have plans with friends tonight." "So do I." I lied. "Sorry." I turned off my phone and slipped it back into my bag, ignoring the complicated twist of guilt and satisfaction in my chest. Small rebellions, small changes. I was still figuring out what kind of person I wanted to be in this second life, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not spend it being everyone's convenient solution. After class, I walked back to my dorm room, a single room in one of the newer buildings, paid for by my parents as a reward for maintaining my high school GPA. The room was small, but mine, decorated with the minimal personal touches I'd allowed myself. A few photos, some plants that were struggling to survive my sporadic care, a poster from an art exhibition I'd attended once and half remembered enjoying. I sat at my desk and pulled out my laptop, staring at the blank screen. In my first life, I had spent my evenings studying, optimizing my schedule, building the foundation for a successful career. I had majored in business administration because it was practical, because it led to stable jobs and good salaries, because it was what my parents wanted. I had graduated with honors, had landed a job at a prestigious firm, had married a colleague my parents approved of, had lived a life that looked perfect on paper and felt hollow at its core. Now, with the chance to choose again, what did I actually want? The question terrified me more than dying had. I opened a new document and started typing, not thinking too hard about what I was writing. Just letting words flow, descriptions of the campus, the coffee shop, Chen Zhao's laugh, the way sunlight painted patterns on the lecture hall floor. Nothing coherent, nothing with a point, just writing. It felt dangerously like joy. 3 months passed like water through cupped hands, similar to my first life, yet different in small, significant ways. I attended my classes, but allowed myself to engage with them rather than just pursuing grades. I had coffee with Chen Zhao twice a week, and we talked about everything from philosophy to our families to the ridiculous price of textbooks. I signed up for the hospital volunteer program and spent Saturday mornings reading to elderly patients. I also watched Xinyi, not obviously, not in a way that anyone would notice, but I paid attention now in a way I never had before. Observed her patterns, her behaviors, the small ways she manipulated situations to her advantage. It wasn't malicious, exactly. She'd learned early that being the delicate, beloved youngest daughter meant others would handle the difficult things for her. Why would she change when the system worked so well in her favor? But understanding her motivations didn't make it easier to watch my parents cater to her every whim while taking my competence for granted. "Wei Wei can handle it," my mother would say when something needed doing. "She's so capable." While to Xinyi, "Don't strain yourself, darling. Your father will take care of it." In my first life, I'd internalized this dynamic. Yi had even taken pride in being the capable one. Now it just felt exhausting. I was thinking about this as I walked to my Friday morning class, the early November air sharp with the promise of winter. The campus trees had turned brilliant colors, reds and golds and oranges that seemed almost artificially vibrant in the low autumn light. Wei Wei! I turned to find a girl from my biology class jogging toward me, her breath visible in the cold air. Liu Maimei, I remembered after a moment. We'd been lab partners in my first life, though we'd never been particularly close. "Hey, Maimei. Thank God I caught you." She fell into step beside me, tugging her coat tighter. "Do you still have those notes from last week's lecture?" I was sick, and Professor Wang doesn't post his slides online. In my first life, I'd said yes immediately. Say had spent my lunch hour photocopying my meticulously organized notes. "Actually," I said, I've been thinking about starting a study group. You interested? Her face brightened. Really? That would be amazing. This class is destroying me. I know 3 other people who might want to join. I'll set up a group chat and we can figure out a time to meet. We exchanged contact information, and as I watched her hurry off to her next class, I felt something settle in my chest. This was different. This was choosing connection over solitary perfection. This was allowing myself to be part of something rather than always standing apart. The shift was subtle, but significant. I was making different choices, small ones that rippled outward in ways I couldn't predict. And the strangest part was how natural it felt. As if this version of me had been waiting beneath the surface of the dutiful daughter I'd performed being for so long. That evening, I sat in my room working on an essay for my literature class. The assignment was to write a personal narrative exploring the concept of identity formation. In my first life, I'd written something safe and generic about cultural expectations and family dynamics. Now, with my fingers on the keyboard, I found myself writing something else entirely. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, following a script written before I was born. Be the good daughter, get good grades, make sensible choices, but whose life is it if I'm only ever acting a part? When does the performance become the person, or is there still some core self beneath all the roles we play, waiting to be discovered? I paused, reading over what I'd written. Too honest, too revealing, the kind of thing that might raise questions or invite concern. I left it anyway. The weekend arrived, and with it, my usual Saturday morning at the hospital. I'd been assigned to the geriatric ward, where I spent a few hours reading to patients, helping with meals, or just sitting and talking. It was humbling work, being present for people in their final years, bearing witness to their stories and regrets and small triumphs. One of my regular patients was Mr. Zhang, 87 years old, a retired engineer who loved detective novels and complained good-naturedly about the terrible hospital food. He reminded me of my paternal grandfather, who had passed away when I was 12. "Ah, Wei Wei," he said as I entered his room, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You brought the good stuff?" I held up the detective novel I'd picked up from the library. "Latest one. Just came out last month?" "Excellent, excellent." He settled back against his pillows, and I pulled up a chair. "Though first, tell me how school is going. Are you studying hard? Making your parents proud?" The question hit differently than it would have before. "I'm studying," I said carefully, "but I'm also trying to figure out what would make me proud of myself." Mr. Zhang's sharp eyes studied me. Wise words for someone so young. Took me until I was 60 to learn that lesson. Spent most of my life building what I thought I was supposed to build, only to realize at the end that I'd forgotten to check if it was what I actually wanted. "Do you regret it?" "Yes and no." He shifted, and I helped adjust his pillows. I had a good career, provided for my family, did work that mattered. But I wish I'd been braver in some ways, less concerned with what people thought, more willing to fail at the things that interested me rather than succeeding at things that didn't. I opened the book and started reading, but his words stayed with me, less concerned with what people thought, more willing to fail. They felt like permission I'd been waiting for without knowing I needed it. The novel was twisty and clever, full of red herrings and carefully planted clues. After an hour, Mr. Zhang dozed off mid-chapter, his breathing deep and even. I marked the page and sat there for a while, watching the late morning sun paint patterns across his blankets. This was real. This mattered. Not because it would look good on a resume or impress my parents, but because it meant something to Mr. Zhang, because it connected me to another human being in a meaningful way. It was the opposite of the transactional relationships I'd built in my first life, where everything had been about networking and advancement and strategic connections. When I left the hospital, the air outside felt cleaner somehow, sharper. I walked instead of taking the bus, letting the cold November wind clear my head. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from my mother. Something about a family dinner, some aunt visiting from out of town, expectations that I would be there looking presentable and acting appropriately. "Can't make it," I texted back. "I have plans." I didn't actually, but I was learning to create space for myself, to carve out time that was mine and not given over to family obligations or academic demands or anyone else's expectations. I ended up at a small bookstore near campus, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and brewing tea, where mismatched armchairs invited you to settle in and lose track of time. I browsed the shelves, picking up novels at random, reading first paragraphs, and deciding whether they hooked me. Wei Wei. I looked up to find Chen Zhao standing at the end of the aisle, holding a stack of books and looking surprised. What are you doing here? Same thing as you, apparently. I held up the novel I'd been skimming, avoiding adult responsibilities and hiding in stories. He laughed. Want to grab tea? There's a good place upstairs. The cafe on the second floor was tiny. Just 4 tables and a long counter where an elderly woman brewed tea with careful precision. We ordered oolong and settled at a table by the window, watching people pass on the street below. I was surprised when you suggested that study group, Chen Zhao said after a moment. You always seemed like more of a solo operator. Maybe I'm trying to be less of a solo operator. Because of the accident? I considered how to answer. Something like that. I guess I just realized that I was so focused on doing everything right that I forgot to figure out what right actually meant for me. He nodded slowly. I get that. My parents want me to go to law school after graduation. It's all planned out. They've already looked at programs, made connections, started setting up internships. But I think I might want to write instead. Fiction? Maybe. Or journalism. Or just words. Something that involves creating rather than just interpreting laws. He looked almost embarrassed. It's stupid, right? Law is stable, practical. Writing is basically financial suicide. It's not stupid, I said firmly, and you're only 20. You have time to figure it out. Do you? He met my eyes. Have it figured out, I mean. God, no, I laughed. I'm majoring in business because it seemed like the sensible choice, but I'm starting to wonder if sensible is overrated. We talked for another hour, and I realized this was the most honest conversation I'd had in either of my lives. No performance, no careful curation of my image, just 2 people trying to figure out who they were beneath the expectations others had placed on them. When I finally got home, it was late afternoon. The house was full of people. My mother's side of the family gathered for one of the endless family dinners that marked the rhythm of our lives. I could hear voices from the living room. My mother's laugh, my father's more reserved responses. I slipped upstairs without announcing my presence, not ready to perform the dutiful daughter role. In my room, I found Xinyi sitting on my bed, flipping through a textbook that wasn't hers. There you are, she said, looking up with a slight pout. Mom's been looking for you. Aunt Ping brought her daughter, and you know how Mom wanted us both to be here. I had plans. What plans? You never have plans. The comment stung more than it should have, partially because in my first life it had been true. I'd rarely made plans that didn't involve studying or family obligations. I'd been so focused on being perfect that I'd forgotten to have a life. Well, I do now, I said, dropping my bag on the desk. Did you need something? She stood smoothing her dress. Something expensive and beautiful that my mother had bought her. Just wanted to warn you that Mom's in one of her moods, the family thing, you know. I knew my mother had always been hyper-aware of how our family appeared to others, how my sister and I reflected on her parenting, her status, her success. These gatherings were performances, and we were expected to play our parts. I'll be down in a minute, I said. Xinyi left, and I took a moment to change into something appropriate. A nice sweater and slacks, the kind of outfit that said, respectable elder daughter without trying too hard. I studied myself in the mirror, noting the ways I looked different from how I remembered. Younger, obviously, but also less tired. There was a light in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of possibility. Or maybe that was just my imagination. Downstairs, I plastered on a smile and played my part. Made small talk with relatives who asked the same questions they always asked. How's school? Still getting good grades? Any special boy in your life? I gave the expected answers, laughed at the appropriate moments, and felt like I was watching myself from the outside. Xinyi, meanwhile, was the star of the show. She told amusing stories, accepted compliments with just the right amount of modesty, and generally sparkled in a way that made everyone warm to her immediately. I watched my mother beam with pride. So I watched my father's rare smile when Xinyi said something particularly charming. This was the dynamic I'd grown up with. This was what I'd spent my first life trying to compete with, never understanding that I'd already lost before the competition began. I wasn't the daughter who sparkled. I was the daughter who was competent, reliable, easily overlooked. But maybe that was okay. Maybe trying to win my parents' approval was a game I didn't need to play anymore. After dinner, I helped clear the table while Shinny entertained our cousins in the living room. My mother worked beside me in the kitchen, rinsing dishes with practiced efficiency. "You could have been more engaging at dinner," she said quietly. "Aunt Ping was asking about you, and you barely responded." "I responded." "Barely." She handed me a plate to dry. "Ni Xinyi makes it look so easy. You could learn from her." The old anger flared, hot and immediate, but I tamped it down. Maybe Xinyi and I are just different people. My mother sighed. "Don't be dramatic, Wei Wei. I'm just trying to help you. You're so capable, so smart. You just need to work on your social skills a bit. Translation, be more like your sister. Be charming and vivacious instead of thoughtful and reserved. Sparkle instead of being steady." "I'll work on it," I said, the lie familiar and bitter on my tongue. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the conversation with Chen Zhao, about Mr. Zhang's regrets, about the life I'd lived the first time, and the choices I was making differently now. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and full of possibility. I had 14 years before the tragedy that had ended both my life and Xinyi's. 14 years to become someone different, someone more authentically myself. But that also meant 14 years of living with the knowledge of how it ended. 14 years of watching Xinyi live a lie that would eventually kill us both. The question remained, what was I going to do about it? The first semester ended in a blur of exams and papers, all of which I navigated with the strange advantage of having already learned the material once. I didn't aim for perfect grades this time, deliberately missed a few questions on tests, turned in essays that were good but not exceptional. Building a facade of normalcy, of being a regular student rather than someone with impossible foreknowledge. Winter break arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside with hot tea and wool blankets. I came home to find the house decorated for the holidays. My mother's aesthetic choices everywhere, elegant and tasteful, and somehow impersonal. Xinyi was home too, having finished her own semester. She seemed different somehow, or maybe I was just seeing her more clearly now. There was something brittle beneath her charming exterior, a fragility that wasn't quite as innocent as she made it seem. She manipulated situations with such practiced ease that I wondered if she even realized she was doing it. "Gigi," she said one evening, finding me in the living room with a book, "can I ask you something?" I looked up from the novel I'd been absorbed in, something dark and literary, the kind of book I never would have allowed myself to read in my first life. When every spare moment had been devoted to studying. "Sure." She settled on the couch beside me, tucking her legs beneath her. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're just going through the motions of what everyone expects, but it's not really you?" The question startled me with its echoing of my own thoughts. "Sometimes," I said carefully. "I feel like that all the time." She picked at the throw pillow in her lap. "Everyone sees me as this, I don't know, this delicate thing that needs protecting. And I've played into it. I know I have. But sometimes I wonder who I'd be if I wasn't playing that role." For a moment, I felt a flash of sympathy for her. We were both trapped in roles assigned to us by family expectations, both performing versions of ourselves that weren't quite authentic. The difference was that her role had always been more comfortable, more rewarded. "So stop playing it," I said. "Be someone else." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "It's not that simple. Mom and Dad, they need me to be this way. And I don't know how to be anything else at this point. It's been so long." I thought about the blood type lie. The one she'd told so long ago she'd probably convinced herself it was true. That was the problem with lies. They calcified over time, became foundations you built your life on, until correcting them felt impossible without bringing everything crashing down. "What brought this on?" I asked. "I don't know, maybe seeing you change? You're different since the accident. Less," she searched for the word. "Less perfect, I guess? More human? And it makes me wonder if I could be different too." The conversation felt dangerous, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. I wanted to tell her the truth, that perfection was a trap, that the roles we played would destroy us both if we let them. But how could I explain without revealing everything I knew? "You could always try," I said instead. Start small. Make one choice that's yours instead of what everyone expects. She considered this, then shook her head. I wouldn't even know where to start. After she left, I sat with the weight of that conversation. In my first life, I'd never known Shinny had these thoughts, these doubts about the role she played. I'd seen her as simply being herself, spoiled, fragile, favored. But maybe she'd been performing just as much as I had, trapped in a different kind of prison. It didn't change what I knew about the future, but it complicated my feelings about it. The weeks passed in a strange domestic limbo. I avoided family gatherings when I could, spent time at coffee shops and bookstores, started writing more. Fragments of stories, character sketches, descriptions of moments that felt significant even if I couldn't articulate why. Chen Zhao and I texted regularly, sharing book recommendations and cynical observations about our family's holiday expectations. My uncle just asked when I'm planning to take the law school entrance exam. He messaged one evening. I told him I'm considering other options, and he looked like I'd announced I was joining a cult. At least he didn't lecture you about wasting your potential, I responded. That's my mother's favorite topic. I want to escape family obligations and get coffee tomorrow. I smiled at my phone. Yes, please. We met at a cafe downtown, the kind of place that was crowded with other students escaping their own family dynamics. The barista recognized us and had our orders ready before we reached the counter. I'm thinking about declaring a double major, Chen Zhao said as we settled at a corner table, business and creative writing. It's probably insane, but it might be a way to satisfy my parents while also pursuing what I actually want. That's a lot of work, says the person who's taking 6 classes next semester. He had a point. I had signed up for an ambitious course load, partially because I knew I could handle it with my advanced knowledge, partially because I was hungry to learn things I'd missed the first time around by being so narrowly focused. Fair enough, I conceded, though I'm dropping business administration as my major. This was news to myself as much as to him. The decision had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks, but saying it out loud made it real. Really? What are you switching to? Haven't decided yet. Maybe literature, maybe psychology, something that interests me instead of just looking good on a resume. Chen Zhao raised his coffee cup in a mock toast to poor life choices and disappointing our families. To actually living instead of just existing, I amended, and we clinked cups. That night, I told my parents about my decision to change majors. The conversation went about as well as expected. Does a literature? My mother's voice was sharp with disbelief. What kind of job does that lead to? Teaching, publishing, editing, writing. Wei. My father cut me off, his tone quiet but firm. We've supported you in your education, given you every advantage. Surely you can see that throwing away a practical degree for something so uncertain would be unwise. It's not throwing it away. It's pursuing something I'm actually interested in. Interest doesn't pay bills, my mother said. Interest doesn't secure your future. Xinyi sat quietly during the entire exchange, watching from the doorway. I caught her eye and saw something complicated there. Sympathy, maybe, or envy, or fear at what my rebellion might mean for her own trapped situation. I'm not asking for permission, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm telling you what I've decided. The silence that followed was heavy, disappointed. My father's mouth pressed into a thin line. My mother's eyes glistened with tears that might have been genuine or might have been weaponized. After everything we've done for you, she said quietly, this is how you repay us? The guilt was immediate and crushing. Years of conditioning telling me I was being ungrateful, selfish, wrong. But beneath it, a newer voice whispered, you died once living their version of your life. Don't make the same mistake twice. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said, and left the room before I could second-guess myself. Upstairs, I sat on my bed and tried to stop my hands from shaking. This was harder than I'd expected, standing up to them, choosing myself over their expectations. In my first life, I'd never found the courage. I'd molded myself to their wishes until I'd forgotten what my own looked like. A soft knock on my door. Xinyi slipped in without waiting for an invitation. That was brave, she said quietly. Or stupid. Maybe both. She sat beside me on the bed. Do you really think you can just choose differently? That they'll let you? I don't need them to let me. I'm an adult. Technically. She picked at her nail polish. But they have ways of making life difficult when we don't cooperate. You know that." I did know. My parents' love had always come with conditions, with expectations that had to be met to earn approval. Jinyi had figured out how to meet those expectations with minimal effort, how to charm and manipulate her way into their good graces. I'd chosen a different path, trying to earn love through achievement, through being capable and reliable and perfect. Neither strategy had led to genuine acceptance. "What's the worst they can do?" I asked. "Disapprove? They already do that. They could cut you off financially, make you leave the house, disinherit you." These threats had terrified me in my first life. Now, having died once, they seemed less important than living authentically. "Then I'll figure it out," I said. "I'd rather struggle doing something I believe in than succeed at something that makes me miserable." Jinyi looked at me with something like wonder. "I wish I was that brave." "You could be." She shook her head. "No, I'm too afraid, I guess, of losing what I have, of finding out who I am without all the protection and padding." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "But I'm glad you're doing it. Maybe it'll show me that it's possible." After she left, I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, my heart still racing from the confrontation. I'd crossed a line tonight, declared my independence in a way that couldn't be taken back. My parents would likely retaliate in subtle ways, withdrawing warmth, making comments, comparing me unfavorably to Zinni at every opportunity. But I'd died once already. Their disapproval couldn't be worse than that. The spring semester started with a burst of cold energy. I'd officially changed my major to literature with a minor in psychology, filed the paperwork despite my parents' protests. They'd stopped speaking to me except when absolutely necessary, a punishment I was learning to endure. Zinni had become my unlikely ally, slipping me money occasionally and running interference with our parents when she could. It was strange, this new dynamic between us. In my first life, we'd been cordial but distant. Now, with my rebellion somehow giving her permission to question her own choices, we were developing something closer to real sisterhood. But the blood-type lie still hung between us, unspoken and dangerous. I threw myself into my new classes with genuine enthusiasm. Postmodern literature, abnormal psychology, creative writing workshop. For the first time in either of my lives, I was learning things I actually wanted to know, engaging with material that challenged and excited me. The creative writing workshop met twice a week in a seminar room with terrible lighting and comfortable chairs. Professor Lin was a published novelist with sharp eyes and a sharper wit, the kind of teacher who could demolish your work and make you grateful for the criticism. Our first assignment was to write a short story exploring themes of identity and transformation. I wrote about a woman who wakes up one day to find she's living in a parallel timeline where small changes have led to radically different outcomes. It was barely disguised autobiography, but I changed enough details to maintain plausible deniability. The protagonist wasn't named Wei Wei, didn't have a sister, wasn't navigating the exact circumstances of my life, but the emotional truth was there. The disorientation, the grief for a life unlived, the terrifying freedom of second chances. When I presented it in workshop, the class was silent for a long moment after I finished reading. That's... Professor Lin paused, choosing her words carefully. "Unusually mature work for an undergraduate. Where did this come from?" "Personal experience," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. We discussed the piece for 20 minutes, my classmates offering suggestions about pacing and clarity while dancing around the raw emotion at its core. Chen Zhao, who was also in the class, caught my eye and gave me a small nod that felt like recognition. After class, he fell into step beside me as I walked toward the library. "That story," he said. It felt real, in a way that was almost uncomfortable. Good uncomfortable, or bad uncomfortable? I'm not sure yet. He adjusted his backpack. It made me think about all the lives we don't live, all the choices we make that close off other possibilities. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. If only he knew. We reached the library steps and he hesitated before heading off to his own class. "Hey, Wei Wei, I'm glad you're doing this. The major change, the writing. You seem more alive than you did last semester." More alive than a near-death experience? I tried to make it a joke, but it came out more sincere than I intended. "Exactly," he said seriously, and walked away. I spent the afternoon in the library, supposedly working on an essay, but actually thinking about the future. 6 months had passed since I'd woken up in the hospital with memories of another life. 6 months of small changes, of choosing differently, of trying to become someone other than the dutiful daughter who died full of regrets. But the blood type issue still loomed. 13.5 years from now, if I did nothing, Zinni would have her appendicitis. She would need a transfusion. The doctors would refer to her records that incorrectly listed her as B negative. And they would give her blood that would kill her. And I would die too. 2 days later, from complications and heartbreak and the weight of surviving my parents' favorite daughter. I could prevent it, could sit Ginny down right now and tell her we needed to get our blood types verified officially, could correct the records before they became deadly. But doing so would require explanations I couldn't give, would potentially expose her to embarrassment and consequences for the long-standing lie. And part of me, the bitter, angry part that had been overlooked and undervalued for my entire first life, whispered, "Why should you save her? Why should you save someone who never valued you, whose existence overshadowed yours, who contributed to your misery, even if accidentally?" I pushed the thought away, ashamed of it. Zinni hadn't meant to hurt me. She was as trapped by family dynamics as I was, just in a different way. She didn't deserve to die for being our parents' favorite, but I also didn't owe her my life. Not again. The moral calculus made my head hurt. I closed my laptop and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to think clearly. "You okay?" I looked up to find Liu Maimei standing beside my table, concern on her face. "Yeah, just tired, too much reading." She slid into the chair across from me. "Want to take a break? The study group is meeting in an hour. You could come early, and we could grab dinner first." In my first life, I would have declined. Zhao would have stayed in the library until closing, would have prioritized studying over human connection. Now, I found myself nodding. "That sounds good." We walked to a small restaurant near campus, the kind of place that specialized in noodles and dumplings, where the food was cheap and good, and the atmosphere was loud with student voices. Maimei ordered for both of us, apparently deciding I looked too exhausted to make decisions. "So," she said once our food arrived, "what's really going on? You've seemed stressed lately." I considered how to answer. "Family stuff, mostly. My parents are unhappy with some choices I've made." "The major change?" "Among other things." She nodded sympathetically. "My parents weren't thrilled when I switched from pre-med to biology research. They had visions of me becoming a doctor, and I had to break it to them that I'd rather work in a lab than deal with patients." "How did you do it? Handle their disappointment?" "Badly at first." She laughed. There was crying, accusations of wasting their money, threats to cut me off, but eventually they realized I was serious, and they adjusted. They're not happy about it, but they've accepted it. And if they hadn't, adjusted, I mean. She took a bite of her noodles, thinking, "Then I guess I would have figured it out on my own. It's my life, you know? At some point you have to decide if you're living for them or for yourself." Such simple wisdom, but it struck me with the force of revelation. At some point you have to decide if you're living for them or for yourself. I'd spent my entire first life living for them, had made every choice through the lens of what they wanted. What would make them proud? What would earn their approval? And I died miserable, filled with regrets, barely having lived at all. "You're right," I said quietly. "I usually am," she replied with a grin, and we finished our dinner talking about easier things. Professors, classes, the ridiculous price of textbooks. The study group was productive, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the collaborative learning, the way different perspectives illuminated the material. After we finished, I walked back to my dorm room through the cool spring evening, feeling something like peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Zinni. "Mom wants you to come home this weekend. Family dinner." I typed a response. "Can't. Too much work." 3 dots appeared, then, "She won't be happy." "I know," I sent back. Then after a pause, "Can I ask you something? Do you actually remember when Mom told you your blood type?" The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before her response came. "What? Why are you asking that?" "Just curious. Do you remember the specific conversation?" Another long pause. "Not really. It was so long ago, why does it matter? Because it mattered more than she could possibly know. Because that small lie was going to kill her in 13 years if I didn't find a way to fix it?" "No reason," I lied. "Just thinking about medical record stuff for a class." "Oh, okay, but seriously, you should probably come home this weekend. Mom's getting really upset about this whole major change thing." I didn't respond. Instead, I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the dorm around me, music from next door, laughter from down the hall, the eternal soundtrack of people living their lives. I had 13 and a half years to figure this out. 13 years to decide what kind of person I wanted to be, what I owed to the sister who'd never asked for my sacrifice, whether preventing a tragedy was worth maintaining a lie. But tonight, I just wanted to be a regular university student with regular problems, essays to write, books to read, a life to live that was finally, tentatively mine. The answer would come, eventually. For now, I had time. Time moved differently the second time around. Days that had once blurred together in my first life. Monotonous study sessions, dutiful family dinners, careful cultivation of the perfect daughter image now stood out in sharp relief. I paid attention to moments I'd missed before, the way Professor Lin's eyes lit up when discussing a particularly complex metaphor, the sound of rain on the dormitory windows, Chen Zhao's laugh when something caught him off guard. I was learning to live instead of just exist. Spring became summer, and I didn't go home for the break. Instead, I took a position at a local publishing house, an unpaid internship that my parents disapproved of. Why aren't you getting real work experience in business? But that taught me more about what I actually wanted to do with my life than any business class ever had. The publishing house was small and perpetually struggling, run by a woman named Lin Qiao, who'd given up a lucrative corporate career to pursue her passion for bringing new voices to readers. The office smelled like old books and fresh coffee, and I spent my days reading manuscripts, writing rejection letters, occasionally finding something brilliant buried in the slush pile. "You have good instincts," Lin Qiao told me after I'd flagged a manuscript that she ended up acquiring. "Have you ever thought about doing this professionally?" In my first life, I'd become a business analyst, pushing numbers around spreadsheets, attending meetings that could have been emails, slowly dying inside while maintaining a professional smile. "I'm thinking about it now," I said. Chen Zhao and I met for coffee every Sunday, a ritual that had become the anchor of my week. We'd started calling it the Survivors Support Group, a joking reference to our shared experience of disappointing our family's expectations. "My dad asked me again when I'm going to be serious about law school," he said one humid afternoon in late July. I showed him 3 articles I'd published, and he asked when I'd stop playing around with hobbies. My mother sent me a printout of successful business administration graduates and their salaries, I responded, with a note that said, "This could be your future." Imagine trying to guilt-trip someone with salary projections. She's very thorough in her disappointment. We laughed, but there was real pain beneath the humor. Our family's disapproval was a constant weight, a pressure that never fully lifted, but at least we were carrying it towards something we'd chosen rather than something chosen for us. It was during one of these Sunday meetings that Chen Zhao asked the question I'd been half dreading. "Do you ever think about what your life would look like if you'd just done what they wanted? Like maybe it would have been easier?" I thought about my first life, the business career, the appropriate marriage, the suffocating sense that I was living someone else's life. I thought about dying at 32, full of regrets, having never really lived at all. "Easier doesn't mean better," I said. "Yeah." He stirred his iced coffee thoughtfully. "My mom told me I'm being selfish, that they sacrifice so much to give me opportunities, and I'm throwing it away on writing stories." "You're not throwing anything away. You're using your opportunities to build a life that's actually yours." That's what I tried to tell her. No, she cried. He looked miserable. I hate making her cry. I know. I did know. The guilt was crushing sometimes, the knowledge that my choices were causing my parents pain. But the alternative was worse. Living inauthentically. Shrinking myself to fit their expectations. Dying full of regrets again. Summer turned to autumn, and I returned to campus for my sophomore year with a clearer sense of direction. I'd declared my official path. Literature major, psychology minor, eventual career in publishing. My parents had mostly stopped speaking to me except through Xinyi, who served as reluctant messenger. "Mom wants to know if you're coming home for Mid-Autumn Festival," she'd text. "Probably not," I'd respond. She's hurt. I know. The guilt never fully disappeared, but I was learning to live with it. Learning to prioritize my own well-being over their comfort, my own truth over their expectations. It was hard. Harder than I'd anticipated even with the clarity of having lived this life before. But I was also happier than I'd ever been in my first life. Taking classes I loved, working toward a career I'd chosen, building genuine friendships rather than strategic networking relationships. I'd even started dating, nothing serious, but casual relationships that taught me what I wanted and didn't want in a partner. In my first life, I'd married the first appropriate man my parents approved of. Now, I was learning to trust my own judgment. The blood type issue remained unresolved, a ticking time bomb I couldn't quite figure out how to defuse. I'd tried several times to bring up the topic with Xinyi, suggesting we both get our medical records verified, but she always brushed it off. "Why does it matter?" she'd ask. "We're both healthy." "For emergencies. We have our information on file." "It's fine." It wasn't fine, but I couldn't explain why without revealing knowledge I shouldn't possess. And as the months passed, the urgency felt less immediate. The tragedy wouldn't happen for over a decade. I had time to figure out how to prevent it. Or so I told myself. My sophomore year passed in a blur of literature seminars and psychology studies, of late-night conversations with Chen Zhao and weekend shifts at the publishing house. I was building a life that felt authentic, meaningful, mine. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what was coming. Couldn't forget that in 11 years, give or take, Xinyi would have her appendicitis. That without intervention, she would die from a transfusion error. That I would die 2 days later, not from my injuries, but from the grief and guilt of surviving her. The question that haunted me: did I have an obligation to save her? And if so, at what cost? By spring of my sophomore year, a year and a half after my rebirth, I'd built a life so different from my first one that sometimes I barely recognized myself. I'd published a short story in a literary magazine, started dating someone I actually liked, a graduate student named Daniel who studied philosophy and had no connection to my family's expectations, made real friends who knew me as I was, rather than as who I was supposed to be. But the comfortable lies I'd been telling myself shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the library, supposedly working on a paper for my modernist poetry class, when my phone rang with a call from Xinyi. Unusual. We mostly texted, and she rarely called unless something was wrong. "Gigi?" Her voice sounded strained when I answered. "What's wrong?" "I'm at the hospital. Nothing serious," she added quickly, hearing my sharp intake of breath. "Just something weird happened, and I thought you should know." My heart was racing. What kind of weird? I went in for a blood donation drive at school. You know how Mom's always saying we should give back and all that? But when they tested my blood type, it came back as a positive. She laughed awkwardly, which is ridiculous, right? Obviously, there was some kind of mix-up with the samples, but they made me do the test 3 times. And it kept coming back the same way. The library suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. 13 years. I thought I had 13 years to figure this out. "Xinyi," I said carefully, "have you ever actually had your blood type officially tested before this?" "What? Of course. When we were kids. Mom told us we were both B negative, like Dad." "But did you actually see test results? Or did Mom just tell you?" There was a long pause. I don't know. I guess she just told me. Why are you asking this?" "Because your lie is catching up with you," I thought. "Because you've been living with incorrect medical information for so long it became your truth. Because in 13 years, this mistake will kill you." "I think you should tell Mom about the test results," I said instead. "Get the medical records updated." These things matter. "But it has to be a mistake. I've had B negative on all my forms for years." "Or the forms were wrong and the test is right." Another pause. "You think I've had the wrong blood type on my records all this time?" "I think it's possible. I think you should get it verified and corrected if needed." "But," her voice went small, "what if I need emergency blood someday? What if there's been an error and something happens?" What if, indeed? In my first timeline, something had happened. And she died. "That's exactly why you need to fix this now," I said. "While there's time." After we hung up, I sat in the library, staring at my blank laptop screen, my hands shaking. This was it. The moment where timelines diverged, where my knowledge of the future intersected with the present in a concrete way. If Xinyi corrected her records now, 11 years before the crisis that would have killed her, we would both live. She'd never need that fatal transfusion because her medical information would be accurate. But it also meant she'd have to confront the lies she'd told so long ago. Have to explain to our parents why her records had been wrong for over a decade. Have to face consequences for something she probably barely remembered doing. And part of me, the part that had been overlooked and undervalued for so long, felt a bitter satisfaction at her discomfort. Finally, she would face a consequence. Finally, her charmed life would have a complication she couldn't smile her way out of. I hated that I felt that way, hated the ugliness of my own resentment, but I also couldn't deny it was there. That evening, Cindy called again. I talked to Mom. She's freaking out. Wants me to get tested at the family doctor to verify, thinks the university clinic must have made an error, but Gigi, I've been thinking, what if you were right? What if I really have had the wrong information all this time? Then you fix it and move on. But how did it happen? I remember Mom telling me I was B negative. I remember filling out forms with that information. How could I have been wrong for so long? I closed my eyes, seeing the path forward with painful clarity. I could tell her the truth, that she'd deliberately changed her blood type on medical forms when we were teenagers, probably as some misguided attempt to be like me, that her lie had calcified over years until even she believed it. Or I could let her believe it was an innocent error, maybe something medical records had gotten wrong long ago. The first option would be honest, but cruel. The second would be kind, but false. Does it matter how it happened? I asked finally. What matters is fixing it now. She was quiet for a long moment. You're right. I'll get it verified and updated. Mom will probably make a huge deal of it, but... She laughed shakily. Better that than having wrong information in an emergency. Better that than dying, I thought, but didn't say. After she hung up, I sat on my dorm room bed and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of it all. The knowledge I carried, the choices I'd made, the sister I'd saved without her even knowing she'd needed saving. I'd changed the future, prevented the tragedy before it could unfold. And Ginny would never know how close she'd come to dying. To never understand that her older sister had carried the weight of her death for months. Never realize that my insistence on verifying her blood type had saved both our lives. But I would know. I would carry that knowledge forward, along with all the other doubled memories of a life lived twice. Chen Zhao found me later that night, sitting outside the dorm in the cool March air. He didn't ask questions, just sat beside me and waited. I think I just saved someone's life, I said finally, but they'll never know it. He considered this. Does that make it less meaningful? Saving someone without recognition? I don't know. Maybe it makes it more meaningful, or maybe it just makes it lonely. We sat in silence, watching students pass by, living their single timeline lives. Eventually he said, "Hey, my story about the man with memories of a life he hasn't lived yet? Professor Gao gave me an A. Said it was the most emotionally resonant piece I'd written." I managed a small smile. Fiction has a way of letting us tell truths we can't say directly. Yeah. He glanced at me sideways. Sometimes I wonder if your story about the parallel timeline woman was fiction, or if you were trying to tell us something real. My breath caught. What would I be trying to tell you? That you know what it's like to live a life that isn't the one you wanted, that you understand the weight of roads not taken, choices unmade, that you've found a way to choose differently. He paused. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. Occupational hazard of studying literature? Maybe you're exactly right, I said quietly. We sat together until late, talking about stories and truth, and the various ways we lie to make the reality we live with bearable. He didn't press me for explanations I couldn't give, and I was grateful for that. Grateful for his friendship, his understanding, his willingness to let some mysteries remain mysterious. The next day, Shinny confirmed what I'd already known. The university clinic had been correct. Her blood type was a positive, had always been a positive. Our family doctor verified it, and the medical records were updated across all her accounts. Our mother was mortified by the error, convinced it reflected badly on the family somehow. Our father was quietly relieved that the mistake had been caught before it mattered. "Thank God you pushed me to verify," Sinyi told me over the phone. Can you imagine if there'd been an emergency and they'd given me the wrong blood type? I could imagine it, had lived through it, had died because of it. Yeah, I said, that would have been bad. Mom's still freaking out though, convinced everyone will think we're incompetent or something. She's probably going to verify her and Dad's blood types now too. Make sure there aren't any other errors. Good, I said. Better safe than sorry. After we hung up, I stood in my dorm room, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The same face I'd seen in the hospital bathroom a year and a half ago, when I'd first realized I'd been given a second chance. But different, too. More relaxed, more alive, less burdened by the weight of living for others. I'd done it. Changed the future. Saved my sister's life. And, in doing so, saved my own. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, I felt oddly hollow. Because what now? The tragedy that had defined my rebirth was prevented. The crisis that would have killed us both was averted. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do, even if the accomplishment had come years earlier than anticipated. Which meant I had no more excuses. No more looming disaster to distract from the harder work of simply living authentically, building a life that mattered, figuring out who I was beyond the roles I'd been assigned or the tragedies I'd prevented. I thought about Mr. Zhang, the elderly patient from my volunteer work, and his words about spending most of his life building what he thought he was supposed to build, about realizing too late that he'd forgotten to check if it was what he actually wanted. I wouldn't make that mistake again. Lania, I'd been given 2 lives, and I was determined to actually live this one. The spring semester continued, and I threw myself into living with a kind of desperate intensity, published another story, moved off campus into a small apartment I shared with 2 other students, started a serious relationship with Daniel, who made me laugh and challenged my thinking and seemed to actually see me as I was. My relationship with my parents remained strained but functional. They'd slowly accepted that I wasn't going to return to business school, though they still brought it up periodically as a possibility once I grew out of this phase. I'd stopped trying to convince them otherwise, stopped seeking their approval. It was liberating in a way I couldn't have imagined in my first life. Ginny and I grew closer, our relationship evolving into something more honest. She never knew that I'd saved her life, but she seemed to sense that something had shifted between us. We texted more, called regularly, met for dinners when we were both home. She'd started seeing a therapist to work through her own issues with family dynamics and the roles she'd been playing. "You were right," she told me one evening over hot pot, about stopping the performance, about figuring out who you are beneath the expectations. It's harder than I thought, but also better? Better how? Just more real. Even when it's uncomfortable, at least it's mine, you know? I knew. Better than she realized. 2 years had passed since my rebirth when I found myself back in that creative writing workshop, now a senior taking an advanced course. The assignment was to write a story about transformation. Not metaphorical transformation, but actual physical change. I wrote about a woman who dies and is reborn, not as an infant, but as herself at 18, carrying all her memories forward, about the disorientation of living in a time you've already lived, the weight of knowledge you can't share, the terrifying freedom of second chances. I wrote about blood and choices and sisterhood, about the ways we lie to survive and the ways those lies can kill us, about learning to live authentically in a world that rewards performance over truth. When I finished reading it aloud to the class, the silence stretched long and heavy. Professor Lin broke it finally, her voice careful. "Wei Wei, that was devastating and beautiful, and unlike anything you've written before." She paused. "Oh, it also reads less like fiction and more like memoir." My hands were shaking as I set down the pages. Sometimes the line between fiction and truth is thinner than we think. "Sometimes," she agreed, "but let's workshop it as fiction for now." The class offered their feedback. Technical notes about pacing and structure, philosophical questions about the ethics of changing the past, emotional observations about the protagonist's isolation and growth. Chen Zhao caught my eye across the seminar table, and I saw recognition there. He knew, maybe didn't know the specifics, but he understood that I'd written something true under the guise of fiction. After class, he fell into step beside me as I walked across campus. "That story," he said quietly, "about the woman who lives twice. What about it? It explains a lot, about you, I mean. About the changes since that car accident freshman year, about how you sometimes seem to know things before they happen." My heart was racing. "It's just a story." "Is it?" He stopped walking, and I had to stop too. "Because if it's not, if you really did somehow get a second chance, then I think you've used it beautifully. You've built a life that's actually yours, And maybe that's what matters more than whether anyone believes the impossible thing that gave you the courage to do it. I looked at him, this friend who'd become something more than a friend, who'd walked beside me through my transformation without demanding explanations, who saw me clearly and chose to stay anyway. Hypothetically, I said slowly, if someone did live twice, what would you say to them? He smiled. I'd say that most people never get a second chance to choose differently, and that using it to become more authentically yourself, to live instead of just exist, is probably the bravest thing anyone can do. He paused. I'd also say that life is strange and full of impossible things, and that sometimes the most important truth is how we choose to live with what we know, not whether what we know makes rational sense. We started walking again, and I felt something loosen in my chest. He knew. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the specifics of the blood type issue or the tragedy I'd prevented, but he understood the essential truth. I'd been given a second chance, and I was using it to live differently. Thank you, I said quietly. For what? For seeing me? For not needing all the explanations? For being my friend through all of this? Always, he said simply. That evening I sat in my apartment, my laptop open to a blank document. For months I'd been writing fragments of my story, pieces of the experience of rebirth, of navigating family dynamics with impossible foreknowledge, of learning to choose myself over others' expectations. Now I started writing it properly. Not as fiction exactly and not as memoir either, but as something in between. A story about a woman named Wei who dies at 32 and wakes up 18 again. About the tragedy she prevents and the life she builds. About learning to live authentically in a world that rewards performance over truth. I wrote through the night, memories of both lives flowing onto the page. The dutiful daughter I'd been in my first life. The person I was becoming in this one. The sister I'd saved without her knowing, the parents I'd disappointed and the approval I'd stopped seeking, the friends I'd made and the career I was building and the relationship I was nurturing. By dawn, I had 50 pages. By the end of the week, I had 200. It wasn't perfect, would need revision and editing and probably significant restructuring, but it was true in the way that mattered most. It was my truth, written down, made real. And maybe, I thought as I saved the document and closed my laptop, maybe that was enough. Maybe the point wasn't to use my knowledge of the future to fix everything or prevent every tragedy. Maybe the point was simply to live, messily, authentically, courageously, in whatever time I'd been given. I'd saved Xinyi. Had saved myself in the process. Had built a life that felt worth living. The rest would unfold as it would, and this time, I'd be present for all of it. The coffee shop where Chen Zhao and I had established our Sunday ritual had closed years ago, replaced by a trendy bubble tea place that neither of us particularly liked. So we'd moved our tradition to a small independent bookstore cafe, appropriate given that we'd both ended up in publishing. Your book is doing well, he said, pushing a copy of the literary review across the table. My debut novel was reviewed on page 3, a thoughtful analysis of its themes of identity and rebirth. 4th week on the bestseller list. I looked at the review without picking up the magazine. In my first life, I'd never written a novel, had never even considered it as a possibility. Now, at 28 years old, I was a published author with a second book under contract and a career in literature that felt both improbable and exactly right. It's surreal, I admitted. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life. Which part? The successful writing career? The fact that your parents actually came to your launch party? Or that you're marrying me in 3 months? I smiled at that. Chen Zhao and I had been together for 6 years now, friends to lovers in the most gradual, natural way. Our relationship felt like the opposite of my first marriage, built on genuine connection instead of parental approval, growing from authentic affection instead of practical considerations. All of it, I said, the whole impossible life I'm somehow living. My phone buzzed with a text from Xinyi. Dinner tonight still on? Bringing the fiancé for your approval. Oh, I typed back a yes, then looked up at Chen Zhao. Xinyi wants us to meet her boyfriend. She says it's serious. Good serious or concerning serious? She seems happy. And she did. Xinyi had spent her 20s figuring out who she was beneath the roles she'd been assigned, had gone to therapy, had built a career in interior design that suited her aesthetic sense and creative energy. She'd dated several men over the years, but this was the first time she'd used the word fiancé. Then I'm happy for her." He paused. "Do you think she ever wonders why you pushed so hard for her to verify her blood type that time? It seems so urgent to you." "Maybe, but she's never asked." We fell into comfortable silence, drinking our coffee and watching the bookstore bustle with Saturday afternoon traffic. I was meeting my editor later to discuss revisions on my second novel. Chen Zhao was presenting at a writers' conference next week. Our lives were full and busy and entirely our own. My parents still didn't fully understand my choices. Probably never would, but they'd made their peace with having a daughter who wrote novels instead of running a business. Attending my book launch had been a gesture of acceptance, even if it came with comments about how writing was a nice hobby, but had I considered a more stable career path. I'd stopped seeking their approval years ago, had learned to find validation in my own accomplishments, in the life I'd built, in the person I'd become. "I've been thinking," Chen Zhao said, pulling me from my thoughts. "About your novel, The Woman Who Lives Twice. What about her? In the book, she saves her sister without ever telling her why. Just quietly corrects the medical error that would have killed them both, and then has to live with knowing she'd changed the future without recognition or reward." He met my eyes. That takes a particular kind of courage. To do something that matters without needing anyone to know you did it. Or maybe it's just easier that way, not having to explain the impossible thing. Maybe. He took my hand across the table. But I think there's something profound in choosing to protect someone even when they don't deserve it, even when they'll never know, even when it means carrying that knowledge alone. I thought about Jinyi, healthy and happy and completely unaware of how close she'd come to dying, about the blood type correction that had happened 10 years ago, or preventing a crisis she'd never know about the weight of knowledge I'd carried and the choice I'd made to save her anyway. "The book is fiction," I said lightly. "Is it? Does it matter?" He smiled. "I suppose not. What matters is the truth underneath the story, the way it makes readers think about second chances and authentic living and the courage it takes to choose differently." We finished our coffee and walked through the spring afternoon, hand in hand. The city had changed in the decades since my rebirth. New buildings, new shops, the constant churn of urban evolution. But some things remained the same. The tree-lined streets, the familiar rhythm of the city, the sense of possibility that came with warm weather after a long winter. That evening we met Jinyi and her fiancé at a restaurant downtown. He was kind and intelligent and clearly adored my sister, which was all I needed to know. Over dinner, I watched Jinyi laugh at something he said, her face bright with genuine happiness, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. She didn't know I'd saved her life. Didn't know that in another timeline, she died at 32 from a transfusion error that had its roots in a lie told so long ago she'd forgotten it was a lie. Didn't know that her older sister had carried the weight of her death for months before finding a way to prevent it. And she'd never know. That knowledge was mine to carry alone, along with all the other memories of a life lived and unlived, of choices made and unmade, of the impossible thing that had given me a second chance. "You seem happy," Jinyi said later, as we waited for our cars. So Chen Zhao and her fiancé had gone ahead, giving us a moment alone. "I am," I said honestly. "Good. You deserve it." She hugged me, and I hugged her back, this sister I'd saved without her knowing, this woman who'd been given the gift of life without knowing the cost. "Thank you, Gigi." For what? For showing me it was possible, to choose differently, to build a life that's yours instead of just living up to expectations. She pulled back, her eyes serious. "I don't think I ever told you how much your courage meant to me. Watching you stand up to mom and dad, change your major, choose your own path, it gave me permission to do the same." Maybe that was enough, I thought as I drove home later. Maybe I didn't need her to know about the medical crisis I'd prevented or the death I'd averted. Maybe it was enough that I'd shown her a different way to live, that my choices had rippled outward in unexpected ways, that we'd both found our way to authentic lives. The book I'd written had a particular ending. The protagonist saves her sister, builds a life that matters, and finally makes peace with carrying knowledge no one else can share. It had been my way of telling the truth under the guise of fiction, of making sense of the impossible thing that had happened to me. Critics called it a profound meditation on identity and transformation. Readers said it made them think about their own choices, their own unlived lives, their own chances to choose differently. And me? I knew it for what it was: a love letter to second chances, a testament to the courage it takes to live authentically, and a memorial to the life I'd lived before, the dutiful daughter who died full of regrets, whose death had somehow given me the chance to live differently. That night, lying in bed beside Chen Zhao, I thought about Mr. Zhang, the elderly patient from my volunteer days who died years ago. He'd told me once that the tragedy wasn't dying, but never living in the first place. I'd died once, at 32, having never really lived, but I'd been given another chance, and this time I was living, messily, authentically, courageously, making choices that were mine, building relationships that were real, pursuing work that mattered. The future was uncertain, as all futures are, but it was mine to shape, mine to live, mine to experience fully instead of just surviving through. And that, I thought as I drifted towards sleep, was worth everything.